Joan Quick to see Smith. I may shift my terminology a little bit back and forth between Native American and First Nations. That's because I'm from Canada, it's an automatic thing. And so some of the contextual work that I'm showing is from Canada because obviously, unbeknownst to the AP Art History people, the First Nations artists in Canada have for the last 20 years been killing it. There's been a lot of really important work happening. And I won't really get into the complicated contextual reasons for that fluorescence, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So this work, 1992, trade, gifts for trading land with white people. What happened in 1992? What was 1992?
Columbus.
Let's look at
500.
the quincentenary. Quincentenary. The 5th century after the arrival of Columbus. So if you start digging around in the art magazines from 1992, you'll find a lot of really interesting work addressing this history. James Luna, a performance artist, has also done some really compelling performative works about this idea of the celebration of Columbus Day. For most settlers or people descended from settlers, Columbus Day is something to celebrate. For many Native Americans, it was a tragedy of epic proportions. It was not something to celebrate. It's something to look back on with a sense of loss and heartache and rage. So Smith is, this is part of a body of work that's meant to be part of an uncelebration, a rejection of the idea that the arrival of Columbus and the European colonization of the Americas were a universally positive phenomenon. So this is a triptych. You guys have been noting sort of familiar iconography. So what is a triptych? Where does that come from?
Medieval altarpieces.
Okay, so we see a triptych and we're like, yes, medieval altarpieces, this sort of folding opening often. And that's certainly, she is engaging in very specific ways with European and colonial histories and contemporary American settler culture, as I will refer to it for this section. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, okay, sorry, yes. So she's referencing these European traditions, but she's also referencing local traditions, and we'll see some examples of this. So I just want to show you another work that was made as part of the same series, the Red Mean Self-Portrait. So tell me what you are seeing here. Have any of you seen this work before?
No.
Okay, good. So tell me about it.
Land art. Oh, sorry, you've already got land art.
We've got the reference to the Vitruvian Man. How does it differ from the Vitruvian Man? In what ways that you can make out? Right, it's mixed medium. She's working on newspapers, and this is an actual outline of her body. She lay down, her husband traced out her body. So it's this indexical trace of her presence. Do you guys know what I mean when I say indexical? Okay, so the term indexical, it comes out of semiotic theory, and it's really useful for art history. So an indexical mark is a mark that carries the sort of history of its own making. A footprint is an indexical mark. A lipstick kiss is an indexical mark. When you look at something, you're like, I know how that was made. I know what action happened there. I can see in my mind's eye the action that created that mark. That's an indexical mark. It points us, like index finger, towards whatever made it. So here we can read this we can sort of see this idea of the charcoal touching her body, moving around her form. We have a clear sense of that connection, instead of it just being something where somebody was looking at something and then translating it. So it's different from the Vitruvian Man in that it's on newspapers, it's mixed media, it's life-sized, it's her own body. What else? What else is different?
No face.
no face, a blank face. Crossed out. So that X goes through a circle. There's a circle in the Vitruvian Man also. How are they different, those circles?
Doesn't fit inside it.
Yeah, she doesn't fit inside it. So on the one hand, this mark seems like a mark of violence, of crossing her out. On the other hand, there's this sense that she exceeds its boundaries.
Well, it looks like a gun's crosser, so you know what I'm saying?
There is a sense of violence in this, a kind of targeting. Now, what are we able to read? Made in the USA. So we know what that means, right? That in a way, that's her saying, remember, I'm American, right? Like this is where I came from. This is where my people came from.
Got the mugshot numbers there.
Okay, but it's actually not a mugshot, but it's important. The number is her registration number as a member of a Native American tribe. So, like a mugshot number, this is part of a sort of homogenized bureaucratic system for organizing people that is imposed by the government on citizens or subjects, right? You become a number. Yes?
Could you say that again? Where does she get this number?
You get it when a Native American person is registered with a recognized tribe. They get a status card and a number that is their number on the register.
That gives them rights to certain
Yes.
benefits or...
Yes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the history of that practice in a bit. Yes. Yeah.
Do you know what tribe she's from?
Yes, she is Salish Kootenai. Let me go back. So she lives in the Flathead Indian Nation. This is the reservation she lives on. And all of the newspaper texts are from the official newspaper of the Flathead Reservation. And the people on the Flathead Reservation are Confederated Salish and Kootenai. I may be pronouncing Kootenai wrong. Salish I'm familiar with. You look...
I'm just wondering if you could spell it.
Oh, of course, yes. Kootenai.
K-O-O-T.
Enai. And Salish, Salish.
Salish comes first.
Yes.
Salish Kootenai.
Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Nation.
Did you say Salish and?
Who have confederated, yes. So Charcusta News is the official newspaper of the reservation, and she uses it as her background in this and in trade, our object of focus. So I want to talk a little bit about the American Indian movement. How many of you are familiar with this? How many of you know this history a little bit? Little bit? So what was the American Indian movement?
All I remember is the sit-in. That's all I remember.
So it parallels the other civil rights movements that are going
Yes.
on, the Chicano movement and the obviously
Black Power movement, yeah. And much like the Black Power movement, it's a separatist, and it also, in both cases, the American Indian movement and the Black Rights movement were started in response to urban police violence. That's how they got started. So they started in the north. The American Indian movement did not begin on reservations. It began with urban Indian communities. So there was, in 1969, so it's sort of as these movements do, it built up over time. It got started in the late 60s. In 1969, they seized Alcatraz. There's a really great meme going around of photographs of people on Alcatraz that says they brought snacks, just in terms of contemporary occupations. So I mean, why occupy Alcatraz? What is its any? Okay, so now I think it's just empty, but it was a prison. But before it was a prison, sorry? Yeah, it was native land. It was.
Where was the prison it was named? Was it significant, like a significant place, or I mean, all of America was native land?
Yes, and I'm not sure of the specificity of it. and the reasons for taking it. I think it may have to do with the fact that it then was used for a prison. But we could dig into that. None of my students have asked me that before. It's a good one. So Smith was in college while this was happening. She was a student in the early 70s. She was a student. In 1972, on the eve of Nixon's re-election, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where no Native Americans were employed, was seized also, and artifacts were liberated from the display cases. So with these occupations and these demonstrations, activists released a 20-point position paper. These are the things we want. We're not just showing that we're mad, we are demanding changes in the relationship between our people and the United States in general. So I'm not going to tell you all the 20 points, but I'll tell you a few key points that are particularly important when we think about contemporary art by Native American artists. So they called for the reconstitution of treaty-making authority. In 1871, the federal government took away the right of indigenous nations or tribes to make treaties. They're like, you no longer have the authority to make a treaty. They're like, we want that back. Another, and this was really important, was the right to interpret existing treaties. The legal interpretation of treaties was all happening in federal and state courts, where in general indigenous people did not have any representation. So they were like, we want to be able to decide what these mean. You can't just take these treaties we made together and say what they mean all by yourself. They also called for a revision of blood quantum criteria, and this is where the idea of Indian status is really important, that number that identifies Smith as a member of a particular tribe or nation. Blood quantum criteria was the amount of blood, Native American blood, coming from a particular tribe or nation that the government required in order for you to receive status as an American Indian. And so one of the most substantial demands made with this, the list of 20 points, was we want to decide what the blood quantum criteria is. You don't decide who's a member of our nation, we do. And that one is actually, there have been significant changes on that front, and there are some tribes or nations where you need one great-great-great-grandparent to be a member, and others where it's much more strict. But essentially, individual communities are able to make that decision on their own. So when Smith shows us her ID number, on the one hand, she's showing us proof, I am Native American, the government says so. So imagine, if you will, I mean, I don't know if any of you are in fact Native Americans, but if you are, or if you're not, imagine how it would feel for your citizenship to be determined not by your community, but by what you saw as an outside force. Imagine if Canadians got to decide whether or not you were an American citizen, right? That would kind of suck. So this sense that her identity, the legitimacy of her identity, is something that is given to her by an occupying force, right? And it's a number. It's this bureaucratic sign of where she belongs. So in this work, we have a combination of these references to bureaucracy, references to the Vitruvian Man, and so the red mean. What's the red mean? Yeah?
Well, I reference is probably the golden mean.
Yes.
When I think of the Vitruvian Man, this was Leonardo's way of saying this is the perfect human.
Yes.
So maybe she's pulling that into question. What is the perfect human? What qualifies that? I don't fit into the circle. Am I not perfect? Am I not?
She doesn't fit into that circle at all. So absolutely, the sense that you cannot in any way be a fully realized person if the definition of your worth is coming from outside your cultural context. That just doesn't work. Instead, you need to come up with you need to have your own system of evaluation, and you need to have your own perfection that's grounded in your realities and your history and your life. So this idea that colonial culture is both bureaucratic and legal and also deeply internalized psychologically. Yes?
That seems so terrible. Is red like kind of referencing this
Yes.
term for
Absolutely, it is. And it has been embraced. So both, Indian, it's based on a misunderstanding of the people who were living here and where exactly here was. But it is widely used within Native American communities. Sorry?
Indian is.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. In general, my rule is I use it when I'm quoting something, right? It's not really mine to use. Red, we see, there's this great website, an author named Paul Chott Smith, who's a cultural critic, Comanche cultural critic, who's really brilliant, and I recommend him. CHAAT Smith. And where was I going? I lost my train of thought again. Red, yes. His website is Fear of a Red Planet. So this idea of red, which started out as a racist epithet, has been by many people sort of taken back, right? So red mean. Okay, so coming back, here we have a detail of Quick to See Smith. I want to talk about the material qualities of this work because it's big, but it's dense. So what does this look like? What are the references, the art historical references that you would draw on here? Sorry? I heard a murmur.
The canoe?
Okay, so we have a canoe, which we tie historically to American pre-colonial cultures of the Americas. Okay, what else? What else do we see? Yes?
It feels kind of Rauschenberg to me.
Yes, definitely. She's definitely looking at Rauschenberg and Johns. I have the next image we're going to look at. We can see her referencing Johns. So what is it about it that reminds you of Rauschenberg?
A combination of the photo montage with the mixture of light colors to kind of create a patchy texture.
Yes, we have the patchy texture and also a drippy texture, this kind of waxy, drippy texture that for Rauschenberg, so Rauschenberg appropriates these painterly signifiers of expressionism, and he combines them with things like newsprint, which are of everyday, ordinary culture. And so he bridges this divide between the sort of high, emotive, highly subjective culture of abstract expressionism and the everyday vernacular culture of life, right? That's why he's often referred to as a proto-pop artist. And so she's borrowing very directly from that relationship. The qualities of color and paint here we read as expressionistic. They communicate something personal, intuitive, improvisational. And she's layered them over images, which unlike Rauschenberg, she's specifically focusing on stereotype and history. So
I should have wondered this before, but is it collage? Are there actual layers?
yes.
Okay, so like the American flag is a photo of an American flag.
Yes. So she has a number of different materials going on. There's the reservation newspaper, right? So that's part of it. And then there are also historical photographs. So up here, we see a pretty familiar image. And she's sort of mixed them all up with, so actual historical images with sort of racist representations, and we'll see a few examples. They're clearer in the upper register in that detail. And so she's combined these materials which signify in a way that Rauschenberg tended to keep a distance from. It's just material. It's just material, doesn't, I'm not trying to tell a story or be political. And again, big gap in time. She's openly activist. He was actively closeted. It's a complicated relationship. But she's bringing these things together. She's layering them and she's owning them. And this is something that we see in a lot of Native American and First Nations art, contemporary art. And it's something that causes controversy. This isn't traditional. It doesn't look like traditional Native American art. Instead, it draws on colonial traditions and brings them into dialogue with contemporary experiences and realities of Native American life. So this is another work, but I wanted to note, because on the Rauschenberg, that there's also a connection to Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg's professional and personal partner for many years. You can't paint a painterly map of the United States without this or one of his other maps coming up. But what's missing from her map?
I love this one because they're all states that are named, the names come from a native tribe. So what's missing is the colonial.
New England.
New England, exactly.
Yes. So she's noting that American culture, as much as it may sort of ignore or sideline the history of indigenous people, they're really deeply tied in to sort of our everyday experiences in this country. Now, Jasper Johns isn't interested in those issues. He's interested in maps, right? He's interested in sign systems, in the way that we communicate actual lived realities as abstractions, right? You can't understand this as the United States if you don't know what a map of the United States looks like, right? You have to learn how to recognize maps, because nobody's seen all of America split up into portions with names in real life, right? You can sometimes get up high on a plane. I don't know how much you can see from space, but it certainly doesn't show borders and state lines. And so he's interested in the way that we translate lived experience into these abstract signifying systems, and she's also interested in that. She is appropriating those systems. For her, a map can be compared to, say, a registration number. It's a way of abstracting a real thing into something easy to read, to systematize, to control. Now, I want to talk about Kitsch, because she's clearly very into, okay, we're going to read this first. I recommend this book. It's really good. Also, Thomas King went to school here. He's wonderful. Long time ago. While the hardware of civilization, iron pots, blankets, guns, was welcomed by native people, the software of Protestantism and Catholicism, original sin, universal damnation, atonement, and subjugation was not. And Europeans were perplexed, offended, and incensed that native peoples had the temerity to take their goods and return their gods. He's a really good writer. He writes fiction also. So he's writing about early trade here. How can we see an exchange of hardwares and softwares, as he describes them, goods and ideas, or even, I think, maybe more usefully, ideologies, goods and ideologies? How do we see that in this collection? What are the cultural forms that we see referenced above? Entertainment.
Headdress, the moccasin.
So this headdress, where do you think you'd be most likely to see it being worn?
6-year-old party.
6-year-old's party, maybe a music festival.
Cowboys and Indians.
Cowboys and Indians. There's a really great a documentary called Real Injun that I recommend about the history of representation of Native people in cinema. It's fantastic. So sports, sort of children's culture, we see all these sort of toys and tchotchkes hung up. These are kitsch, right? This is what we mean when we talk about kitsch. Now, what is kitsch to you guys? What does that word mean? Knickknacks. Trashy stuff.
Not well made.
Yes.
No, it's not valuable. It's
crummy.
throwaway stuff.
So there's a modernist critic named Clement Greenberg. Are any of you familiar with him? Yeah, some of you are like, oh yes. Clement Greenberg, who wrote an essay called Avant-Garde and Kitsch in 1939. And in it, he outlined a relationship between avant-garde and kitsch, obviously. So I'm just going to give you a really quick précis because I think it's helpful, and he's one of those figures who's enormously influential. If you're looking at a modern artist, if you're looking at an artist who engages with the languages of abstraction, which she is doing with these sort of painterly marks, it's important to know that his argument would have been a part of her world and thinking. So basically what he argued was that kitsch is a product of modernity. That over the course of the 19th century, cities grow, factories are built, people move from the country into the city to work in factories. So we have an urbanization of culture that takes place in the 19th century. We just crossed the line globally when more people live in cities than in rural areas. That happened a couple of years ago. But it was well on its way when he was writing. And he said these people, they come and they live in the city and they work really, really hard in factories. They have these boring, tedious, back-breaking jobs in factories. But what they don't have is the sunrise to sunset schedule that they had when they worked on farms, right? Your life is no longer determined by the sun rising and setting. Suddenly there's light everywhere. You can go out at night. So you do your hard work for 14 hours, 6 days a week, and then you have a little bit of time left over, and they want you to spend your money in that time that you've been working so hard to earn. Now, the problem is, if you're exhausted, you don't want to read a really hard book. You don't want to go and look at a painting you don't understand. You want something that is easy to understand because you're exhausted, right? You're tired. You all know how that feels. When you get home tonight, I hope you all get to sit down and enjoy that last season of Parks and Rec that just came up on Netflix. I'm so excited. You need some downtime. So kitsch is cheap. It's affordable to people who work in factories, who have minimum wage jobs, and it's easy to consume. So what they have left behind is folk culture, which is ingrained in sort of generation after generation of developing sort of narratives, music, visual or craft forms, and they've moved to the cities and they're lonely, they're isolated, they have no culture, but they're bored. So kitsch was made to fill the void, right? That's what it's there for. The avant-garde emerged in response to kitsch as a way to, and this is Greenberg's sort of thinking, to separate art from culture, to keep it safe, to take good art, challenging art, the kind of art that the proletariat couldn't possibly understand because they were too tired, and to put it somewhere safe and separate. And it became more and more esoteric and self-involved and abstract, right? Because it didn't care about communicating and needs to protect itself from kitsch, because kitsch is seductive. It's there all the time. So by the 1970s, when she's studying art, this division is really well practiced. This sense that these mean mass-produced, trashy culture that's easy, and these sort of abstract marks reference this sort of field of culture as something autonomous, separate. And she's just smashing them together. She's like, forget it, we can't separate these things. And any more than we can separate native culture from colonial culture, right? They occupy the same spaces and times. They are tangled up in one another. What it means to be Native American has been largely determined by colonial stereotypes, by guys like this. And you can't undo that, you can't erase it. You can't be like, no, I am of the Salish Kootenai Confederation, and I am just completely in that culture, and it hasn't changed, and I won't change, and that's all I am and all I will ever be. Mass culture will affect you. And colonial mass culture includes a lot of stereotypes of Native Americans. So this is, I mentioned Paul Chott-Smith before, this is one of the problems he works on. How Native American communities and cultures incorporate and own these stereotypes, how they repurpose them and politicize them. Yeah?
When you were saying about this putting together of the two, I thought of her name.
Yes.
Smith is
Yeah.
so, how English is that, right?
Very.
So did she choose her, I mean, especially her middle name? Is that a chosen thing, or is this something?
Oh, that's a really good question. In terms of her biography, her father was raised very traditionally and spoke Salish. She didn't. She wasn't allowed. She was a member of the generation that was not allowed to learn her traditional languages, who was forced into colonial schools and had to speak English. And so she's talked about her relationship with her father and the fact that she has to translate his stories into English because she can't tell them in the original language. So I don't know what the origin of her name is, whether that came from her parents or if it's something that she took on. But again, I think we could find that with a little digging.
I think in the Khan Academy,
Does it say?
I think, if I remember right, she was given the name as a child because she could see a bigger
She had good vision.
kind of had
Yeah.
maturity and could make connections quickly.
I mean, it's a good name to have as an artist.
It's cool.
Yeah, right? So these are just a couple of examples of what you're contending with. As a Native American woman, how do you frame yourself? How do you feel beautiful? What is the aesthetics of feminine sexuality and beauty in indigenous cultures when this is going around, like this bizarre mishmash of nonsense that nobody would ever wear in the real world? And then on the other hand, we have this, the Redskins icon, which has been very controversial, right? I think they're still using it, but they don't have copyright anymore, so people can do whatever they want with it. So, I just wanted to, that we don't, okay. Back to the big one. So I want to return, again, so here we can see the things that are colonial reproductions or stereotypes of Native culture. And we can see much less clearly actual Native culture in the form of the newspapers from her reservation, right? But we can't make them out unless we go and we sort of read carefully. It takes work, it takes effort. And then this familiar icon of the canoe, which is sort of deeply associated with trade, of course. But I want to talk about the triptych because there is an interesting history of triptychs in Native American art. It's a different kind of triptych. So this is a 19th century transformation mask, closed and open.
Which is one of the works on our list.
Oh, awesome. So you guys know way more about this object than I do. Do you want to tell me anything about it?
It's a performative piece.
Yeah, it opens.
Yeah, typically, well, always when it's closed, it's an animal, but when it's open, sometimes it was a human, sometimes it was a creature, but usually referring to an ancestor in some way. And then obviously made from organic local materials.
Right. So here we have a work by a contemporary artist, Lawrence Paul Ewell-Lipton, and so closed and open. How does this compare to that? I mean, you guys are familiar with it. Read this for me as a transformation mask.
Well, I mean, maybe just, in a transformation mask traditionally, it's when it's open that the person is revealed, the human. And so it's like there's this, a real history. And so it's like what the real American Indians are interested in is self-government now. When it's closed, then it's this red man thing. Yes,
it's a kind of stereotyped Northwest Coast style mask that stands out in its materials, right, which are not the kind of organic, natural materials that we see here. It's brightly, gaudily colored, these metal reflective beads for eyes or buttons for eyes. But it opens, and the focus is contemporary political realities. The focus here is being in control of one's nation, right? Rather than being under the control of others. Do you guys know Brian Jungen? He's so great. The kids love him because they love Nikes. You should show them this. It's so great. So basically, Brian Jungen, he's of mixed European, First Nations descent, West Coast, and he makes these masks out of Air Jordans. So there are any Air Jordan fans here? Do you know how many different editions there are of Air Jordan?
The original Air Jordans are like Jumpman series.
There, let's say, I don't even know what that means, but by 2005, how many would you?
They were up to 27.
Okay.
Something like that.
All right, so let's say for now that he did 27. Although,
No, it was like 23, I think. 22, 23, something. It was in the 20s.
okay, well that's 23, so there definitely would have been that many. He did one for each edition. No more than one. Collectors went bonkers, right? And so he takes these sneakers and he reconstructs them as a mask. And this project happened when he was in New York City. He was on a trip to New York City, and this is from Berlin, but it just, as an example, he went into an anthropological museum and saw these masks associated with his traditional culture in plexiglass boxes. Right, on display in plexiglass boxes. And then he went to the Nike flagship store because he really loves basketball and sneakers, and he saw that they were displayed in the exact same way. So what he recognized was that these sneakers, like the masks, are a fetish. So I'm using the term fetish here in anthropological terms. Are you familiar with that? Or are you just like shoe fetish? What? Okay, we usually use this term in relation to sexual fetishes, but a fetish, there are many more kinds of fetish. So anthropologically, a fetish is what we call a ritual object that people invest with magical or spiritual energy. A sexual fetish is an object that people invest with libidinal energy. So a fetish is an object that has this added value, that's a kind of mystical, magical value. One of the more familiar, so it was always used to describe like non-Western cultures, religious practices. But for anybody who isn't Catholic or who doesn't believe in the Eucharist, that it reads as a fetish, right? It's a liquid and it's wine and a cracker that are God, right? So for anybody who is not invested, who doesn't follow that belief system, oh, it's a fetish. Sure, that thing's just invested with spiritual power by the people who engage with it. So how would Nikes be a fetish?
Jump higher.
They are magic. They make you a better basketball player. Magically, you jump higher. They are invested with the magic of Michael Jordan, right?
The same reason that lucky jeans make you lucky.
Exactly. Yes. I'm not familiar with lucky jeans, but I'll take that example. So he's acknowledging this cultural parallel between traditional Northwest Coast Native American ceremonial masks and contemporary urban basketball shoes. Right? He's saying they operate in very similar ways.
But the Jordan, it's more than just a shoe.
Yes, exactly.
It's not
Yeah.
a basketball shoe.
Yeah.
Well,
Like when you say
That's-
you're downplaying what it like really is.
I'm-
It's like when you get into it, I mean, like the subculture within like the Jordans is
Yes.
crazy.
So
And, like,
you are the Catholic who believes that the wine is blood.
Yeah.
Essentially,
If
yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
have a pair of Jordans growing up, you are not to the level of your peers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And so he's acknowledging that
Yeah.
crossover. Yeah, no, it's serious. I know.
right, he's a believer.
Yes.
Hey, I love Jordans. I have a couple pair at home. They're the best basketball shoes you can buy.
Well, this should be your new favorite artist.
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely check them out. This
Yes.
stuff's awesome.
So, and I wanted to include these more recent works to give you a sense of the consistency of this practice amongst Native American and First Nations artists who instead of, and Smith has talked about it, she's like, I'm not interested in just being like, oh, woe is us, horrible things happened to us. Yes, they did. If anybody's seen The Revenant, wow, the occupation of this country was so brutal. It was a pretty good movie. But anyways, there is this sense instead of looking towards the future. And you can't look towards the future by pretending that colonization hasn't happened. There is no post-colonial in the Americas. There is, as she says, post-Columbian, right?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You said you used the term First Peoples. If you're talking about this artist, do you talk about him as a Native American artist?
He's First Nations.
He's a First Nation, and would
Yes.
Americans call him that as well?
If they were following Canadian polite language, you're fine calling him a Native, I would call him a Native Canadian artist. I mean, it's challenging because for many Indigenous people, that border is nonsense. It means nothing. It's just bureaucracy and numbers and slightly different laws. But it wouldn't hurt for your kids to learn about First Nations. It's a problematic term in that, like, nation is a very European concept, but at the same time it offers a conceptual sovereignty to the people in question, right? You're not just describing people as sort of like savages out in the wild, tribal people out in the wild.
Well, so a First Nations artist wouldn't differentiate between a Canadian First Nations artist and an American First Nations artist. It would just be, we are First Nations.
Yes, or Indian.
Or
I mean, that's the thing. People often, Indigenous people in North America often use Indian. But if you're not Native American and First Nations, I wouldn't recommend it. It's a little problematic. You can always ask people, what do you prefer? Often people prefer to be called by their specific nation. Yes, okay. So again, this idea of hybridity between a colonial and indigenous culture, and an acknowledgement of the contemporary world.